Valère Pelletier, I want to ask you to kickstart your personal engine and come and sit on the chair next to me. Welcome, Valère. You have a fan base over there.
Yeah, definitely.
You're the General Director of RATP City Solutions. So RATP is a company from the metro for the people who are not based in Paris. But can you tell a little bit more about City Solutions?
Yes. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm very delighted. So you might know RATP. We are operating the transport in Paris. So if I'm a bit lucky, some of you have used RATP here today. You might have a ticket from RATP in your pocket. So thanks very much for using that. RATP, we are not only operating transport, even if we are trying to do that well, we're also operating city services. So that's what we are doing in RATP Solutions Ville, which I'm heading. We are doing services linked to mobility, but are linked to also real estate, telecoms, energy, logistics, and all forms of new mobilities. So RATP is not only Paris Metro. First, it's beyond Paris. We are present in 15 countries, but it's also beyond pure transport because we're doing real estate and we are linking mobility to other parts of the city's life. So to give an example, for example, we are operating social housing. So we are owning social housing where we've got 9,000 social housing in Paris, and we are trying to connect it as best as possible. First, those social housing are used to host some RATP drivers. So when they don't earn a lot of money, they need to be very close to the city center so they can operate at 5 in the morning when they get up. They have to go and drive the bus, they have to go and drive the metro, so we're trying to host them as close as possible from where they work. And they don't have a massive pay, so therefore we have to have some social housing which we are operating ourselves. So what we're doing is that we've invested at RATP Group, we've invested in a car-sharing company called Communauto, which you might know they are originating from Canada. And we are invested in their French branch, and we've done a partnership between Communauto and our social housing company, whereby all people living in the social housing of RATP, they can use, at a discounted price, the car sharing of Communauto, which are just down in the car parks that are just below the social housing estates. So we are trying to see how mobility, in an intelligent way or in a comprehensive way, can be useful for the rest of the city. So that's one example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned already that you want to make connection between real estate, telecom, mobility, urban logistics. So it's really a more holistic approach because it's the thinking in silos where it goes wrong,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Could you give an example? I think the stadium of Lyon.
Yes. I think we've got,
example.
Yeah, that's, we are learning. RATP, we've been existing for 100 years, so we do have some experience and some things that failed. And we clearly see that when we see things separately, so real estate, education, transport, that doesn't work if we do not connect things together. So if each one is doing a very good job in a silo, overall, it's not a very good job collectively. So we've seen bad example of project being thought only in a silo. So I'm coming from Lyon, so I will quote a project from that city. You've got a very big stadium, Le Grand Stade in Lyon, that was built as a magnificent stadium, but the public transport and the public amenities around it have not been thought at the same time. So you've got a massive stadium, you've got no good roads, you've got no car parks, and you've got no public transport to get to the stadium. So when you look at the people getting to a stadium, there's a peak of use, and it's an empty stadium because people get a lot of time to get to the stadium. So the idea is that you've got to think about the amenity, the accommodation, in the same time as the mobility, and also the real estate that goes around it. So another example where it didn't work is the Châtelet-Léal. So people living in Ile-de-France, in Paris, Châtelet-Léal is the biggest hub of public transport in Paris. And it used to be the location of the big market in Paris, but it has been thought initially only as a project, a transport project only. And therefore, our pure engineers have done an excellent work because the transport network is perfectly well connected. However, it had a direct impact on the suburbs, or on suburbs coming to Paris. And this hub became, it should have been an urbanistic project. It became something that it was not really nice to get to. So if you think transport and mobility on its own, it doesn't work. It has to be an overall project. And shall I just give an example of things can work, exactly, in a positive way? And I think that's also an example that can inspire some of us today here at ChangeNOW. 8 years ago, at RATP with the city of Paris and the region, the Paris region, we decided to shift the entire bus fleet. So that's 4,700 fleets. It's the biggest fleet of buses in Europe. We said, okay, let's shift it entirely from diesel. It was 100% diesel. We shifted it to entirely green vehicles. So it's half biogas, half electric vehicles. So that's massive. It's hundreds of millions. And first, we entered it in saying, well, that's a mobility project. We just changed the motor of the vehicle. So we went and said, well, we have to buy a new fleet, and we started to do that. And so it started that way. And then we said, well, actually, we need now to have massive energy supply. Because in the bus depot, it's not only a bit of diesel when I need to, it's massive electric supply that I will need to have. So we had to work with the energy ecosystem, saying, well, can you do that? When can I use the network? And for example, they said, well, usually you can use the diesel in the day. Well, you will not be able to reload the buses during the day. If you do so, the entire network will fall. So we said, okay, that's not a good news, but we'll have to reload it only at night. Okay, fair enough. So first step, it's not only a transport project, it's also an energy project. You have to understand the other issues, the other constraints, otherwise it doesn't work. And the third step was to say, it's not only a mobility project, that's not only an energy project, that's also a real estate project. Because when you're putting all those buses with massive batteries, lithium batteries, you've heard about it, well, there's a risk of fire. So the fire starters tell you, well, actually, the way you used to park the buses is not valid any longer. Because our diesel buses are really close to each other. And then they said, well, you have to have several meters between each other so that if a fire comes from one bus, it shalln't go to the other one. So we said, okay, but it's a big Tetris, and we've got everything packed. They say, well, we just can't give you the right to operate if you don't do what I say. So we had to rethink everything, and we had to do some urban development. We had to dig the floor, put the buses downstairs, sell the square meters above to real estate developers, so we get money and we reinvest in the project. So that became from a pure motor issue, so transport, that went into an energy issue plus a real estate project. Hence, the conviction we have that to make a success out of a city project, whichever it is, now you have to speak all the languages of all the sectors. Otherwise, you have a magnificent silo, but that will not connect with the rest of the city. So that's, I think, a good example.
Yeah, by cutting carbon emissions, then it became an energy project, a real estate project, and you're tackling the whole ecosystem.
And maybe just to quote a figure, so when we're shifting away from diesel, that's half of the entire bus operation CO2 emissions that disappeared. So that's to give you an idea how massive that is. 50% CO2 gone. That was worth the effort.
But now we're talking about buses, but RATP City Solutions, it's more than just buses. It's about mobility here in Paris. Could you give some more examples of how you're trying to make it easier for the end users?
Yeah. So within RATP Solutions Ville, we've got a subsidiary dedicated into the investment into startups of the mobility and urban services. So we've invested in carpooling, in car sharing, in car parks sharing, in bikes. So we've invested in ZenRide, we've invested in ZenPark, in Klaxit that we sold to BlaBlaCar, that might ring a bell. So we've developed as minority stakeholders. We often have 10% in each of those just to accelerate them and help them out, and mixing their services with our services. What I said with social housing and car sharing is an example. But for example, we're also using in places where public transport is, when you're in a city center, it's worth making public transport. You've got the critical mass. That means if I put a bus, it won't stay empty, it will be filled. If you go further in the suburbs, it's less worth having a big bus. It's not as easy to fill it. So what we do is that we complement the center of the city's network, which is with buses, with carpooling. So we do carpooling in complement as a complementary tool of public transport. So when we design the network, we say, well, the center will be buses and the rest will be carpooling. So that's the complementarity we always seek in our project.
Mm-hmm. All right. And if other cities come to Paris and they ask for what are the key factors that we really need to implement when we develop a new neighborhood, what would your advice be for them?
My first one will be don't jump the gun. Take some time upfront in the project of investing a bit of time in dialogue with the stakeholders, talking to the industry, so the private sector, talking to the several sectors involved. Even if your project is a project of energy or telecoms, well, it's worth investing 1 month maybe earlier, have a dialogue with each of the parties, because the month you'll have invested will save you a year later. As I said, the bus project we carried out, if we had known up front the issues we would have with energy and with real estate, we would have saved maybe 2 or 3 years. We were, as always, pressed by time. Therefore, we went early. But I think the advice I would have is take a bit of time to dialogue with the ecosystem before launching the procedure, because it's often a public procedure, which is quite rigid. But before that, just take a bit of breath before jumping into it.
Yeah, and while taking your time to develop it well, how do you take accessibility for everyone into account? Because and how to make it affordable? Because if you have a transportation mix and then you take the bus and then you move to a step and then to a car sharing, isn't it becoming expensive at the end of the day?
Well, that's a fair point, which is why you said 2 things: accessibility and affordability. So maybe on accessibility, I think there's a wrong idea, is that every single mobility has to be fully accessible. I think that is not possible. But the mix of mobilities altogether has to be accessible, because accessible means accessible to everyone, and we are all different. So we can have disability, or we can have a pushchair, whatever. We are in some different situation, and we have to make sure that the entire panel of mobilities we have at disposal, this panel makes it accessible to me in my very... So having a rich panel is the best solution of ensuring we are as accessible as possible. And then affordability. So that's a very fair point. And there's an issue about the role that the public sector has to play in those services. Well, we are a state-owned company, so maybe what I'm saying has to be seen through those eyes, but I think that the public sector has to be ruling and regulating those services. What has been shown by my colleague as an introduction with the bikes, where you see craziness of bikes being spread away, is just crazy. You have to have a strong public sector, which does not mean putting a lot of money. I think that the public sector has other ways to intervene than just putting money in. I think it has to edict the rules of the game.
And that's your opinion, because probably the audience does think that the public sector should invest more, because people are complaining that they should get rid of their car, because they have still a gas-powered car, but then they want to take the bus and they have some trouble arriving at their destination. So they're looking at the government. So please invest in public transports.
Yeah, I'm trying to find a middle ground there, because I'm not saying the public sector shall not invest, of course. However, I'm saying there is some private initiative that has to find its way, but you have to have proper rules based on a long-term basis where the rules are known and are not changing all the time. Well, we've seen situations where cities have changed the rules. Well, we say for the e-scooters in Paris, the Paris mayor has changed the rules halfway through, and that was quite difficult for people to readjust. They had to cut the service. So I think the public sectors has to put some investment where no one else can put some money, but where there is some private initiative, you just have to regulate and say the rules are those ones and they are fixed and stable for some period of time. Because the instability, the public money can be unstable because the public elected members can be unstable, because time is also of the new election makes them be sometimes a bit quick. There needs to be a public authority that fixes the rules for long term.
Mm-hmm. But then again, will it still be affordable for the people? Because if it's the private sector who, okay, public sector can set the rules, but the private sector, they can raise their prices.
Yeah, well, we have some, well, the urban mobility is a good example. There's a massive amount of money being poured by the, well, they were startups, they are not any longer, but they are, you've got strong investment from corporate ventures, big funds being put into those companies. They could do much better than they do if the rules were clear. They could invest in the cities where the framework is stable. I think there is some money for mobility. I mean, the e-scooters and the e-bikes that we see, that's a lot of millions on the ground. And some of them are lost because the rules are not stable and are changing all the time. Or people are just not investing because they say, well, if I'm investing and in a 12 months' time, rules will be just overdone, well, I'm not investing. So I think there is some money. As we see with the Limes and Uber, they do earn some money. So as long as the public sector does its job of regulating it properly, I think this money will find the right service.
And what are the priorities in setting the rules?
Good question. I think that will be, well, you've got several. I think, well, our vision at RATP is that an urban project can succeed only if two things are prioritized. First is inclusion. So inclusion is saying it has to be accessible, affordable, or at least thought for everyone in the city. Otherwise, you'll have a clash, you'll have ghettos, and that will not work, because it will not be supported by the publicly elected members. So first, inclusion, and the second, environment. And we see that, at least I'm talking for Europe. Maybe in other countries, well, I wouldn't say I'm judging that. But in Europe, if you're not environmentally sustainable, you won't last long. And we saw that was one of the issues for the e-scooters in Paris. They said that's a waste of the batteries. They are gone in the Seine River. So that was one part. So I think the public sector has to make sure that inclusion, and environment are built in the services that are provided.
Mm-hmm. All right. I see, again, we're running out of time. So I want to ask you maybe one more question. If people still have some doubts about the added value of RATP City Solutions, and there are some real estate people or people who need a more holistic view, what's your last message you want to give to them?
Yeah, that won't be for RATP. I think it's just a conclusion saying, well, we are so stronger when we work together. I mean, when people are talking, it's always worth investing a bit of dialogue before launching a big project. We see there are millions available for cities. It's a very strong economic and dynamic area as a city. I'm talking about London or Paris or Roma. But just take time to respect what other people are doing And we at RATP, that's our job. RATP Solutions Ville, we are trying to make sure that the real estate are talking to the mobility expert, they are talking to energy expert, to telecom and health and education. That's our work. We're trying to do that for the greater good. And I think that's, when it's done, it can do great things. And otherwise, that's a bit more complicated.
Okay, we should take a bit more time to respect the different aspects when we're trying to transition our cities towards a more ecological city. Okay, Valère, Pelletier, I want to thank you for your stories. Please give him a round of applause.